All
All
right.
right.
Thank you, Laura. And good evening, everyone. It's just a bit after 8 p.m. here in Ottawa, Kansas, a little after 7 p.m. in Arizona. It's just a tad after 6 p.m. on the west coast of the United States. It's a little after 4 a.m. in Kyiv, and just a little bit after 5 a.m. in Moscow. But in Moscow, of course, we're not sure what year it is. Likely not 2024, but that's part of our conversation for this evening. Good evening, everybody. I'm Steve Foulke, professor of history at Ottawa University, and it's a pleasure to join you this evening. I think pleasure is the word. We're brought together once again by the events in Ukraine, and tonight, Ukraine Update and Outlook 2024 is really a kind of second glimpse at the situation in Ukraine. Almost 2 years ago to the day, I came to you all along with Bill Titsui to talk about the start of a really quite astounding event, a war in Europe, and the European capital was being encircled by Russian soldiers. It was to the point where I think a lot of people were concerned that perhaps Ukraine would fall very quickly. In fact, it was rumored, right, that Russian soldiers carried with them dress uniforms so that they would be ready for a parade through the Ukrainian capital. But of course, that is not what has transpired. That's not where we are at the moment. A special welcome to those who are outside the Ottawa University community. I'm really pleased that you all are here. Again, a special welcome too to the history students at Surprise and our history students of Ottawa University that are online. We're really pleased that you're here as well. And we've got a couple of recent history graduates who will be joining us this evening. And I'm just thrilled that you all are able to join us this evening. Yes, so as you can tell, I'm joined by a couple of other people. Let me introduce them now. I'm joined this evening by Morgan Williams. Morgan Williams graduated from Ottawa University in May of 1961 with a BA in economics, and then he graduated from the University of Kansas in May of 1962 with a master's degree in economics. Morgan was appointed by the U.S. Secretary of Agriculture, Clifford Hardin, in March of 69 to be the Kansas State Director of the USDA's Rural Economic Program. In 1977, Morgan became a professional staff member of the U.S. Senate Agricultural Committee in Washington, D.C., working with Bob Dole, Kansas senator of some renown. Williams then was the Midwest Director for Dole's Presidential Committee in 1979, and he was the staff director of the Ranchers and Farmers for Dole Presidential Committee during Dole's run in 1988. Morgan made his first trip to Ukraine in the fall of 1992 and has been working on economic development of Ukraine for the past 31 years. Morgan became president and CEO of the U.S.-Ukraine Business Council, the Trade Business Association, in January of 2007. And Morgan Williams was awarded the 2011 Outstanding Achievement Award from Ottawa University. I'm also joined, of course, by my colleague in history, in the history department, Dr. Andrew Eric Wright. Dr. Wright was born in Omaha, Nebraska in 1987, so he is the kid on the block here this evening. He joined the U.S. Army upon graduation from Topeka High School in 2005. He completed basic training at the Armor Training Center, which is then located at Fort Knox, Kentucky. And Dr. Wright then was awarded the MOS Military Occupational Specialty of 19K M1A1 Armor Crewman. So during his 5 years in the Army, he served all 4 positions on the Abrams tank and completed two combat tours to Iraq. He served with the 1st and 25th Infantry Divisions, as well as the 1st Cavalry Division. He has a degree in history from, of all places, Ottawa University. He also has an MA in ancient and classical history with an emphasis on ancient warfare from American Military University. and is a PhD from Liberty University, where his research was in modern U.S. military history with a focus on Operation Iraqi Freedom. Dr. Wright has a book coming out, Death Before Dismount, U.S. Army Tanks in Iraq, that's coming out in September of this year. And his ongoing research focuses on the leadership, tactics, and weaponry used during combat. So I'm really pleased that Morgan and Andrew are able to join me this evening to talk about Ukraine. Morgan, you have lived and breathed Ukraine for over 3 decades, and you know it inside and out. But a lot of people on the Zoom call tonight really are less familiar with Ukraine. And so, Morgan, it would be helpful, I think, if you could just talk for a couple of minutes about sort of what Ukraine is, where it's located. Historically, what has it sort of specialized in? When you think of Ukraine, what do you think of? So you can just talk for a couple of minutes, just in general terms about the Ukraine.
Steve, thank you very much. I'm very pleased to have the opportunity tonight to work with you and Andrew on this webinar about Ukraine update and outlook for 2024. This idea was presented to me by Chancellor Bill and Wendy Lee when they were in Sacramento, California, not too long ago. We talked about doing this, and then you followed up. As we know, Chancellor Bill of Ottawa University is a professor of history, and he was very well informed about the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe and Ukraine. I would just like to say, I guess I'm 100% Ottawan, if that's a good word. I was born at Ransom Memorial Hospital. I went to high school in Ottawa. I graduated from Ottawa University. I taught economics at Ottawa University for 3 years. Then I served on the board of trustees for 6 years. So I'm very proud to tell everybody I'm from Kansas. I'm proud to tell everybody that I'm from Ottawa. The U.S.-Ukraine Business Council in Washington, D.C. was started in 1995. The purpose of the U.S.-Ukraine Business Council was to promote Ukraine as a place to do business, to promote Ukraine with U.S. companies, to invest there and create jobs. It was organized to help Ukraine be a better and easier place to do business in the fall of 1995. As you said, I went to Ukraine for the first time in the fall of 92. The U.S.-Ukraine Business Council has 220 members, and that makes us the largest private Ukraine-specific business council anywhere in the world, except inside Ukraine. So our business council has been working to promote Ukraine, to increase the jobs in Ukraine, and increase the economic development of Ukraine. I'd like to say that Ukraine is the size of Texas, to give you some perspective, and it's the largest country in Europe, larger than France, but it's not larger than Russia. But we don't consider Russia a part of the Europe anymore after what they've done. So Ukraine is the largest country in Europe, the size or more than the size of France. And it's interesting that 7 different countries border Ukraine. That's Russia, Poland, Hungary, Moldova, Belarus, Slovakia, Romania, and then the Black Sea. So you have lots of countries on the border, and then you have the Black Sea. Now, throughout history, there were 2 main reasons why everybody wanted Ukraine. And every country around there ran over Ukraine or controlled part of Ukraine at one time or the other. They wanted access to the Black Sea, and they wanted the farmland in Ukraine. Ukraine has some of the best farmland in the world. They ended up being the breadbasket of Europe. They ended up being the breadbasket of the Soviet Union. And today they're one of the largest growers of food and exporters of food. Ukraine, as I said, has been run over by everybody. They got run over by Lithuania, Poland, Russia, Austria, Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, the Swedes, and the French. They never were fully independent until the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. That's really shocking to say that this country never was fully independent. Only for 2 years after World War I. They declared independence on August 24th, 1991, now almost 33 years. This is the longest period in their history. Ukraine, unfortunately, for the last 100 years, has been considered the bloodlands of Europe. There were more people killed in this area probably than any other area of Europe in the last 100 years. In 1922, the Soviet Union took over Ukraine, except for the western part, and that was by Poland. Stalin then wanted to kill all the farmers so he could find electric collective farms. So he starved around 7 million of them to death in 32 and 33. Then in 36 and 38, Stalin had the great purge and put people in the gulag. 1941, Hitler took over Ukraine. And the Holocaust did not start in Poland or someplace else. The Holocaust started in Ukraine. The Nazis rounded up 34,000 Jews in 41, put them in a ravine outside of Kiev, and killed all of them in 2 days. They murdered 34,000 people in 2 days. And then later in another town up near the Soviet border, they rounded up 10,000 and killed all of them in 2 days. So Ukraine has been considered the bloodlands. The Soviet Union had it, Hitler had it, gave it back to Russia. Stalin took it over again. It's just been amazing. So the Ukrainians have had many fights for freedom for a long period of time. And then after they became independent, one thing they did at the urging of the United States was that they gave up their nuclear weapons. Ukraine was the third largest nuclear weapon country in the world, behind the United States and Russia, when the United States talked them into giving up all their nuclear weapons, and it was all paid for by the United States. Many people say now they should not have given up their nuclear weapons, but they did at the urging of the United States. Then Ukraine had to fight for its freedom again in 2004 during the Orange Revolution. They had to fight for their independence again in 2014 for the Revolution of Dignity to throw out a corrupt president. And then Putin invaded and took Crimea and parts of eastern Ukraine. So Putin, this is a 10-year war that Putin started 10 years ago. And in all those circumstances, Ukraine chose Europe. They wanted to be a part of Europe. They wanted to move toward Europe. They wanted to be a member of NATO. They wanted to be a member of the European Union. That was not acceptable to Mr. Putin.
That's right.
Putin did not accept that. And so then we came today where he invaded again 2 years ago. And as you said, he thought he would take Ukraine in 30 days. And now it's been 2 years. So the fight for freedom in Ukraine goes on.
It's remarkable. I mean, it's remarkable. I think you really set it up well there, Morgan, to give us a sense of the Ukrainian will to persevere. And so we'll talk about the military piece of this in just a moment. But Morgan, can you give us a sense that Ukraine it's a functioning country, that there are people in Ukraine, that there's an economy in Ukraine, that people live in Ukraine, that on some level it functions. Now it's clearly in a war footing, but on the other hand, there are certainly parts of Ukraine that I don't know if normalcy is the word, but people are getting on with their lives. Morgan, can you talk a little bit about what the economy is like circa 2024? I mean, what are we talking about here in terms of Ukraine as
Ukraine was a very prosperous country in the Soviet Union. It was the breadbasket of the Soviet Union. It was also the industrial center. All of the rockets, all of the Russian, Soviet Union military equipment was made in Ukraine. So when Ukraine became independent, it fairly quickly, it had a functioning economy, and of course it had to be converted to the private sector. And so Ukraine moved quickly. The United States helped, European Union helped. Ukraine became very prosperous, considering they were part of the Soviet Union. The agriculture got going, industrial steel mills got going. Kiev is the largest city, and law firms were started. So it was given the fact that they were a part of the Soviet Union since 1922. It did very well, and it was making a lot of progress. It had its own government. It was a democracy. They elected their own president, and so actually they didn't go as fast as a lot of us wanted to, but surely they were moving forward, and they were doing very well.
Right.
Till, of course, Putin invaded 10 years ago, and he took Crimea, and now he's, of course, invading again. And Putin says the Ukrainians and Russians are one people. He says that Ukraine is not a real country,
right.
Not a real state. It's a part of Russia, and he wants it back. Ukraine, a lot of times in the Soviet Union, was called Little Russia. But Kiev, Ukraine, was started 700 years before Moscow. So Putin is the most despicable historian in the world today. He wants to rewrite history. He says history is what he says it is. And another issue, he's got the largest propaganda program in the world to spread his historic lies about the relationship of Russia and the relationship of Ukraine. Ukraine wants to be independent. They proved that over and over again. They want to be a prosperous country. They want to be a part of Europe.
They desperately want Europe. And then this is the thing that's what's driven Putin to distraction. And I think, as you're suggesting, he believes forced his hand twice with two invasions as the Ukrainians were looking west and instead of east. But Morgan, Ukraine privatization taken hold in Ukraine over the past few decades. Obviously, the war has been extraordinarily destructive. That goes without saying, but there's a real appetite to bring Ukraine to bring it back somehow. And so, if possible, Morgan, if the war ceases, or there's some sort of cessation in battle, what would a rebuild in Ukraine look like? Can you talk a little bit about what is already sort of in place to move Ukraine in a more positive direction, if it's possible in terms of the war settling down?
Today, about 2/3 of Ukraine is free of Mr. Putin. Mr. Putin's forces and what he's taken is about a third of Ukraine and eastern Ukraine, next to Russia and Crimea. So when you get into Kiev, it's a very prosperous city, and you go on to Lviv in western Ukraine. That part of Ukraine has not really been subject to massive destruction such as eastern Ukraine. Putin shot some rockets in there, some drones in there, but Ukraine has done a good job to fight back. So about 2/3 of Ukraine is trying to move forward. And one thing I'd like to say is that there's a ton of U.S. companies there, lots of U.S. companies there, probably 100 Fortune 500 companies. A lot of them came in the 1990s. Luckily, they haven't left. They don't want to leave. They want to do business in Ukraine, and they've contributed hundreds of millions to humanitarian. They protected their employees. So that's a great thing that Ukraine's got going for it, is the U.S. business community and the international business community. But there's been rapid destruction by Mr. Putin, and he's done. You can't think of anything that he could do destructively that he hasn't done. He is the essence of evil, as you know. He fits right along with Hitler and with Stalin as the demons of the 20th and 21st century. And so Putin is demonic. He's the essence of evil, and with his destruction, of course, he's tried to destroy the infrastructure, apartment buildings, a lot of things. So Ukraine's got to rebuild. The United States jumped in. Europe finally jumped in, but the United States went slow. But they're doing better, except right now, and you're going to talk about that later. All the banks in the international banks have helped. So Ukraine's had a lot of support to keep it going, and it's going to need a lot more, but it will survive, and it will grow, and it will be free and independent.
Thank you, Morgan. So you've set it up well. Give us a sense of where Ukraine is. Give us a sense of its economic development and potential. And so now let's think a little bit about what has transpired, what we have learned over the past 2 years. And let's bring in Andrew if we could. Andrew, can we talk a little bit about what we've learned? Can we talk a little bit, Andrew, first of all, about what we've learned about the Ukrainian army? So 2 years ago, I think the world feared that Ukraine would fold quickly under the the Russians, the feared Russian army had pushed into central Ukraine. Russian tanks, paratroopers were dropping in throughout the central part of the region. Yet, not only has Ukraine held on, but they have also then pushed the Russians back. What have we learned, first of all, Andrew, about Ukrainian forces?
A lesson that the United States unfortunately learned during Operation Iraqi Freedom is simply because you have tank and armor superiority does not mean a quick victory. The Russian forces came in very confident in the fact that they had a larger number of tanks, although those tanks were not more modern than the Ukraine tanks. They were all Soviet-made tanks, and I'll show a picture of those here shortly. But I think the idea was that because they had a larger number of tanks, that they were just going to steamroll through Ukrainian forces. And one thing you cannot measure when it comes to warfare is the ability or the will of your enemy. How badly do they want to fight? How badly do they want to defend themselves? And at what lengths will they go to defend themselves? And I think that's something that Putin could not measure, nor could his military force measure.
Yeah.
One thing I will say, I hope I'm not jumping the gun, is that during the U.S. During our fight in Operation Iraqi Freedom and Enduring Freedom, the idea of UAVs, unmanned aerial vehicles, became incredibly popular.
Well, this is yeah. So could you? So I think even people who are just, if you will, casual observers of this conflict have noted a couple of things. One is, again, the prevalence of tanks. The other would be the prevalence of trenches, and the other being then drones, right? Unarmed craft. That it seems as though this particular conflict, there's been almost a complete embrace of drone aircraft, and both Russians and Ukrainians are using them to, if you will, great effect. Yeah. So can you talk a little bit about what we're learning here about military equipment in addition to the will to fight?
Oh, no problem. Can everybody see the screen?
We can.
Okay, good. So the things I'm going to show you just to give you a visual of what UAVs are and what their capabilities are and why they're being used. The first one is a TB2 used by the Ukrainian forces. The TB2 costs anywhere between $3 to $5 million per UAV. The goal of this is it's a much larger UAV. The goal of this is purely reconnaissance. You will see the larger UAVs. Most of them do have the capability to fire on the enemy. But the TB2 is one for reconnaissance. The next three I'm going to show you are the Russian ones, so you can see the differences between the Ukrainian one and the Russians. The first one is the Orlan 10. So you can see the difference in size. It's an incredibly smaller one. This one is also for reconnaissance. The Aileron 3, incredibly small, again for reconnaissance. The largest one that is used by the Russian forces is the Orion series. There's several that they use. This is the largest one. This costs about $6 or $7 million a piece. the goal for this is this has the capability of both launching aerial strikes and providing reconnaissance pictures, okay, for the Russian forces.
What's the range of that? So I mean, with this large one, I mean, what are we talking about in terms of how far it can travel, and where would the Russians be controlling it from? Would they be controlling it from Ukraine? Could they be controlling it from Russian sovereign territory? Yeah, just give it. Can you give us some sense? I mean, these things are obviously very sophisticated, but with something like this, what's its range?
So you would be controlling that from the battle zone, from as you continue to fight, anywhere between 7 and 10 miles. Anywhere between 7 and 10
Wow.
miles
Okay.
for the smaller ones. The mileage for the larger ones are going to compact anywhere from 3 to 5 miles above in the airspace. And the good thing about the reason you use these is for the Russians, they realize that trying to use brute force and bully the enemy is not working. So they're trying to find another way to identify where the enemy forces are, and to, in many cases, engage the enemy forces without having to lose any more men.
Yeah.
For the Ukrainian resistance fighters, I would say this gives them an advantage about where the enemy tanks are, about where the enemy armor is. One of the things, and we'll talk about tank warfare here in 2 seconds. One of the things that um, we learned about the Ukrainian forces and the Russian forces is they use very aged tanks, very aged tanks. They're in a lot of ways, the tanks that they are using for the Russian forces are the exact same tanks that the Americans fought during Operation Desert Storm, Desert Shield. They're the exact same tanks that were fought at the beginning of Operation Iraqi Freedom. Just to give you an idea of the main battle tank of Russia, it's a T-72 tank, right? To compare it to the Abrams that the United States used, the Abrams weigh about 69 tons. The T-72 weighs about 41 tons. It's a much lighter, much older tank. The Ukrainian so they use several tanks, a T-80, the T-64, and as we will talk, and I'll give it back to Steve. I know we want to probably discuss how NATO has affected the use of
Yeah.
the armored force during this fight.
Well, this is, I mean, so with this display of armament, it is, I think it does raise the question about NATO and NATO's participation. So to be clear, Ukraine is not a member of NATO. I think it's clear that if Ukraine is going to survive into the future, it will need to be a part of NATO. And I think that one can imagine that this will happen at some point in the near future. However, over the past couple of years during the war, NATO has actually expanded. There's no question that the war has shaken NATO members on the eastern flank. So NATO has added both Sweden and Finland in the past couple of years, and NATO has delivered quite a bit of material to Ukrainian forces, in addition to providing training. It's an interesting kind of gray area, right? Because again, Ukraine is not a member state of NATO, and and not all NATO members have been on board with delivering material. Poland, it's been on board. Germany, not been on board. The United States, well, we'll talk about the United States in a bit. So Andrew, let me turn back to you for a second. What have we learned about NATO? NATO, which, right, I think for a while, I think there was real questions about what the future of NATO was. I think NATO has kind of found its legs with this war in a weird sort of way. So what has been revealed to you about NATO, do you think?
I think the participation has been something that is the willingness to participate, the willingness to give aid is something that I think probably shocked a lot of people. The amount of aid that has been given to the Ukraine forces. I think you could probably make the argument that without the aid of a lot of these armored vehicles, that this war probably would not be in the situation that it is today. When it comes to military advisors, NATO as a whole has done a fair job in sending advisors. I will tell you, as far as the United States military advisors, a lot of the advisors that were sent there were tankers, armor
Yeah.
officers, and the reason for that being that the same, as I discussed, the same types of tanks, the same types of enemy capabilities that the United States previously saw. Those officers they gave and are currently giving the Ukrainian forces good advice and good counsel about how to counter the type of weaponry that they're seeing in combat right now.
So there has, I mean, it's fair to say that NATO has, in its own way, stepped up and assisted, provided meaningful assistance to Ukraine, and Ukraine has used this assistance to really push back Russian forces. Now, I think we would all acknowledge that the past few months have been a difficult one for the Ukrainian army, in part because Ukraine is, they're running out of munitions. And so if we could just think a little bit about the U.S. role in all this for a second. It is the case that Donald Trump is not the president of the United States, but I also think it is the case that Donald Trump is calling the shots in American foreign policy, particularly when it comes to Ukraine. I don't think there's much doubt about that. So the United States, over the past 2 years, has given somewhere, I mean, estimates vary, but somewhere around $125 billion of military aid to Ukraine. That being said, not much military aid has made its way to Ukraine from the United States for the past probably year and a half. And Ukraine is in quite frankly, real trouble in this regard. So what happened? So in the United States, Morgan and I in particular grew up in a world where the United States, where politics ended at the water's edge, and where American politicians agreed when it came to foreign policy. That world, I think Morgan and I would agree, is over, because what Ukraine has become is a very much a kind of domestic political issue. So in the United States, the Democratic Party has been open about Ukrainian aid. And the Democrats control the US Senate, not to get too inside baseball, but they control the US Senate just barely. And you also have in the US Senate a handful of Republicans who are supportive of continued military aid to Ukraine. So recently, the Senate passed a fairly robust aid bill, but then what, right? Because in order for aid to make its way from the U.S. to Ukraine, it has to pass both houses. And in the U.S. House, it's a different kind of story. So for reasons that are kind of both complicated and murky, the GOP in the United States is, well, many people in the GOP are not particularly interested in Ukrainian aid. And most notably, that's Donald Trump. The GOP controls the House of Representatives, but barely controls the House of Representatives by just a handful of seats. There is a new Speaker of the House, a guy by the name of Mike Johnson, who is a Speaker since October. And there's a certain volatility in the Republican caucus in the House. The volatility comes from the fact that the Republicans have created a scenario where a single member can call for a vote on the speaker. So if a speaker runs afoul of the Republican majority, one person on the Republican majority can call a vote. And this is what happened to the previous speaker, Kevin McCarthy. So the current speaker, Mike Johnson, is in a kind of delicate position. He has a fairly unruly caucus. Many of them are dead set against aid to Ukraine. And so a Senate has passed a bill, and now it's up to the House. Will the House, in fact, act on it? Now, the Speaker of the House has tremendous power, has the power of the calendar, and can, stop a bill really in its tracks. There is, however, a pathway. And the House has all sorts of Byzantine rules, but one of the Byzantine rules is something called discharge petition. And discharge petition actually then bypasses the committees, bypasses the speaker, and puts a bill straight to the House floor. So currently, there is, in fact, a Republican representative from Pennsylvania, from Bucks County, Pennsylvania, Brian Fitzpatrick, who is sponsoring or is talking about sponsoring legislation, defense bill, a defense bill that would send billions of dollars to Ukraine. Now, this is delicate on a number of levels, right? In order for this bill to pass, he's going to need some Republican votes and he's going to need a lot of Democratic votes. There's no way that a bill is going to pass the House without aid to Gaza. It's a whole other conflict, right? So House Democrats are going to insist that there is aid to Gaza and humanitarian aid for Gaza in a defense appropriations bill for Ukraine. And so we're going to see a sort of a standoff here in the next month. I think the vote will come sometime late March. All right, so what will happen is that the vote will come to send aid to Ukraine. It'll go to the House. The House Speaker, undoubtedly, Mike Johnson, will oppose it. If it passes the House, then Mike Johnson probably also will have to cede his speakership because there'll be a lot of upset people on the Republican side. And so it seems conceivable that the U.S. in the next month or so will send a fairly robust aid package to Ukraine, a much needed aid package in Ukraine. But I think the question and the last question I like the group to think about is what next? Again, certainly Morgan and I grew up in a world that was very much defined by what happened in World War II. And part of what happened in World War II is the U.S. took a position of leadership in Europe. It helped to establish the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It bolstered the North Atlantic Treaty Organization for over 70 years. And one wonders if that will continue, right? Because it's the 21st century. And what was established, those kinds of linkages, those kinds of expectations, those kinds of responsibilities, I'm not sure that they connect with the American public today. And I'll turn it over to Morgan and Andrew in just a second. But I've had a lot of conversations with students over the past, this is the finals week in my international relations class. I've had a lot of conversations with students in international relations about this. And to a person, they're concerned about Ukraine, very concerned about Ukraine. But to a person, they're very concerned about the U.S. involvement in Ukraine and whether or not it's the U.S.'s fight. And if it's the U.S.'s fight, why is it the U.S.'s fight? That kind of thing. And so let me just, Morgan, so let me just give you your thoughts about this. So what about the U.S. responsibilities in Ukraine? Is this something that do you think that, well, what's your take on it?
Steve, number one, the United States was responsible for Ukraine giving up its nuclear weapons. If it hadn't been for the United States putting pressure on Ukraine and paying for it, they never would have given up their nuclear weapons. They wouldn't be in the situation they are. And the United States basically told Ukraine, we'll support you, we'll protect you if you give up your nuclear weapons. They didn't sign it, and they claim now it was just a memorandum of understanding. But let's remember, it was the United States that didn't want nuclear proliferation around the world.
Right.
And we talked about number 3 nuclear power in the world out of it. Number 2, let's recognize that this is the major battle for freedom in the whole world. There's other skirmishes going on, but this is the major battle for freedom. And Ukraine's not just fighting for its own freedom, they're fighting for the freedom of Europe and for the freedom of the whole world. Putin's not just fighting the Ukraine, he wants to expand and expand and expand. So they're fighting on Ukrainian soil, not U.S. soil. They're fighting with the Ukrainians dying, not Americans. All Ukraine wants is American hardware and software in order to fight Mr. Putin. So it seems like a no-brainer to support Ukraine because it's a massive battle for freedom, not just from Ukraine. The number one thing that's happened recently is that President Zelensky and Biden said we've got to build a military-industrial complex in Ukraine. The big U.S. military companies have got to get involved in Ukraine, and they've got to build military equipment there if Ukraine is going to survive. And so many U.S. major military companies are in Ukraine. They're looking for partners. They've got to build the largest private military industrial complex in Europe inside Ukraine. Another thing is Putin blocked the Black Sea. You couldn't ship grain out of there. Ukraine needed the money from the grain. The world needed the food. You know, how desperate do you get to be when you block food from leaving Ukraine? And most of that money that is spent by the United States has been spent with U.S. defense companies. Most all of it stayed in the United States.
Right.
Most all those defense equipment that we've donated to Ukraine was built in the United States. So people forget that most of the money you're talking about was spent in the United States with U.S. defense companies.
All right. Right. Very okay. Yeah. So
Ukraine wants to be in NATO. They want to be in the European Union. They want to move toward Europe, and they're still fighting for that. And the United States, no question about it, should be supporting them more than they are. And like I said, Putin's got a distorted sense of history. There's a few people in the Senate and the House that's got a distorted sense of history. One of them said that helping Ukraine is like welfare.
Right.
School did he go to? What history books did he read?
Well, so Morgan. I think perhaps this is the change that we're seeing in American politics, right? And so the notion here is that the United States has had responsibilities in Europe dating back to the end of World War II, and I think many people, and I think that many people on both parties are starting to ask fundamental questions about that and about the length to which the United States is expected to go to defend Ukraine and other countries in Western Europe. And so I'm going to give Andrew, give me a chance to weigh in on this. So Andrew, what's your reading of this? So circa 2024, I mean, NATO again has existed. You know, it's a Cold War organization. That's where it was born from. Is the United States going to continue to be a robust partner in NATO? What's your thought?
I think they have to. I think they need to. Just speaking militarily, this is a fight against oppression, a fight against tyranny, regardless of how you try to shape it up, regardless of what the fighting is going on in the halls of Congress. This has to be a situation where you look at it as one country is fighting for their lives and fighting to oppress and defend against someone who is trying to, to enslave them. And are we militarily going to stand by and do nothing while this happens? And you have to ask yourself, what are we if we stand by and do nothing? Because I think if we look at our country's history, at least militarily, we definitely benefited from the aid of foreign powers coming to make sure that we were okay, coming to make sure that we defended ourselves from those who would enslave and oppress us. So I think we have to look at it like that. Who are we and what do we stand for if we do not give this aid when they desperately need it at this moment in time?
Okay. All right. So thank you both for that. I think you're both weighing in very much leaning in a very similar direction. We'll take some questions, Laura. If there are questions from the chat, I would just remind everyone on the Zoom call tonight that we are but 242 days away from the presidential election, and I think it's fair to say that this is the most important election in Ukraine's history, because I think it's clear that if Trump wins the election, well, Ukrainian aid that's probably not in the cards. Okay, so we have a question. So Laura, would you how would you like to do this, Laura, with the questions in the chat?
Go right ahead if you want to read them.
I'm happy to do that. So here's a question, and Morgan, why don't you take this one, please? So the question, Morgan, is: where are Ukrainians currently sheltering from war? Do we have some sense of the death toll in Ukraine since Putin attacked 2 years ago? And finally, Morgan, Crimea. the southern part of Ukraine, extreme southern part of Ukraine. Do the Ukrainians have any hope of reclaiming that? First of all, Morgan, can you take the question about where Ukrainians are sheltering from the war? I mean, this is the reality. What's happening?
Many of the Ukrainians, a lot of them, of course, left when Putin invaded, and they thought he was going to take over most of Ukraine, and maybe all of it. A lot of them got out and went to Europe, and quite a few of them went to the United States. But as things developed, as I said, 2/3 of Ukraine is not under attack now, and so most of them have gone to Western Ukraine, out around Lviv, and many of them are sheltering out there.
Yeah.
A lot of them have come back, and as I said, U.S. companies and others have kept the jobs open. They've kept supporting their people, and so a lot of them are trying to get back to normal. And a lot of them that left Ukraine have come back, but there's a lot of them in Europe. Mr. Zelensky said just recently, probably 50,000 Ukrainians have died in the war as soldiers, and
Right.
the number of private citizens is amazing. Putin doesn't care if he sends rockets to a hospital, to a church, to a school, to an apartment building. He doesn't care. He doesn't care how destructive he is. He doesn't care how many people die. And so it's been massive, the deaths in this war. And Russia suffered a lot of them also.
So the president, Ukrainian president, talked about death toll the other day. Some people suggested that he was undercounting it. Maybe as many as 70 to 80,000 Ukrainian military deaths. I would remind here people on this Zoom call that in the United States suffered 58,000 deaths in the Vietnam War over a 15-year period. Ukraine is a much smaller country as well. I would just add to this, I could, in terms of Crimea. Crimea is where the war started some 10 years ago. And it's a very important part of Ukraine to Russia. I'd weigh in here. I think it's unlikely that Ukraine will be able to reclaim Crimea. I think every war comes to a negotiated end. And one wonders if Ukraine will be able to reclaim all of its territory, all of its sovereign territory. I think that's very much an open question, particularly in eastern Ukraine. If I could, we've got another couple questions here. Some believe, and Andrew, how about this? So could you take this one, please, Andrew? Some believe this is a war of attrition. If so, who has the advantage? So, Andrew, your thoughts?
Normally, I would always say, militarily speaking, that the home team always has the advantage. But I would point out a couple of things. One, I think this greatly depends on the aid that is going to be sent to the Ukrainian resistance forces in the future, first and foremost. Two, I will tell you that the Russian forces had about 4,700 tanks and armored vehicles to start this war, and they've lost about 2,300 of those tanks and armored vehicles. So I would tell you that although the Ukrainian forces are greatly depending on a care package, so to speak, to be able to withstand and continue to fight, they are holding their own. They are causing a great amount of damage to the armored and mechanized forces of the Russian military.
No question. Russia has suffered extraordinary casualties in 2 years. Estimates vary. Nobody's really sure. Certainly over 100,000. In one battle recently for a small town in eastern Ukraine, Russia experienced over 14,000 casualties. Russia historically has been able to have a different kind of mindset when it comes to losses. Keep in mind that this is a country that lost millions of people in the first two world wars, and that there's not a family in Russia that has not experienced war death in the 20th century. It's somehow it's almost kind of baked into the Russian character in terms of that this is kind of an expectation for Russia. So in terms of attrition, I'm kind of leaning in your direction. I just think it's really very much up to what NATO's willing to do. Morgan, a question for you from the chat. Morgan, the question is, what has been the effectiveness of economic sanctions over the past 2 years? What's your reading of sanctions? And I think probably in Russia, the role of sanctions in trying to slow down Putin's war machine. Do you have some sense of this?
Steve, one quick comment.
Yes.
Russia lost millions of people, but they also murdered millions of people after World War II. It's amazing how many millions of people that were killed by Stalin in the Soviet Union. We just like to say that in terms of building Ukraine for the future, there's massive work going on in terms of building Ukraine. There's many, many companies that want to expand. The international banks are ready. Everybody's ready, but you can't go put a lot of private money in Ukraine as long as the war risk
Right.
is what it is. So that's holding back the development of Ukraine.
Sure.
Future is war risk. Everybody says we got to reduce the war risk before we could go in there, but there's massive numbers of countries. So repeat the question to me.
Yeah. So what's your understanding of sanctions? So economic sanctions in Russia in terms of slowing down the Russian war machine. Have you had what's the word that you hear on the street in terms of from the business community about business in Russia, particularly Western companies in Russia?
It's really interesting to see that after Russia came in and those sanctions was put on, a high majority of U.S. companies working in Russia left.
Yes.
McDonald's left Russia altogether. They had 800 stores. They had 60,000 employees. They completely left Russia, and we've been encouraging companies to leave Russia. The sanctions from the United States, we think they were too slow. We think they were too small. The United States has still been putting some sanctions on.
That's right.
Russia is very clever about how you get around those sanctions, and they're being helped by other countries in the world who are siding with Russia. Putin said, I'm a strong man. He got up and said, send me your troops. Send me Iran, send me your rockets. Send me your drones. I can't fight this war by myself.
That's right.
Well, whatever. He's got a lot of support around the world from rogue nations, and they're helping him avoid the sanctions. The United States every week announces new sanctions, but they could do a lot more. Europe could do a lot more. The sanctions have not had the effect that everybody thought they would in shutting down Russia's economy.
I think that's absolutely right, Morgan. And I think the recent death of dissident Navalny, the United States has even become has offered even more sanctions, upwards of 500 economic sanctions. But I think there was high hopes for economic sanctions at the beginning of the war 2 years ago, and they just have really failed to really slow Russia and really failed to dissuade Putin. Another question from the chat. This one's for Andrew. If Russia loses the war and Ukraine is able to retain independence, will there be consequences for Russia? What do you think, Andrew? What would consequences look like? Could the United Nations or NATO, could they have the power to contain Russia, like Germany after World War I or II? What's your thought about sort of containing Russia and consequences for these actions?
I think there definitely should be consequences for their actions, and I'm going to go ahead and be on the optimistic side and say that a bill is going to be passed and sufficient aid is going to be given to them. So now we're not talking about sustaining the fight; we're talking about actually being victorious. And if they're able to do that, I would like to believe that NATO. They would making sure that the Ukraine keeps their independence a priority.
Yeah.
I would want to believe that if everything goes the way that I would hope it does, and Ukraine is able to be victorious, that we would not just up and forget about the Ukrainian forces and the Ukrainian people and say, well, you guys won, so now we're going to pull out. No, I think we have to probably be under the understanding, even if NATO doesn't give the sanctions that I believe they should, even if NATO is not able to contain Russia like I believe they're going to, we have to assume that that Ukraine is not going to be safe simply because they may achieve military victory in this conflict.
And I would go, thank you. And I would go back to one of the things that Morgan said about defense industries, and one of the areas that Ukraine will need to become more robust in, and that's being able to manufacture weaponry, manufacturing munitions. And I think that it's clear that has to happen. Yeah, go ahead, Morgan, please.
Steve, one question. The question is, what happens if Putin takes Ukraine? Ukraine becomes a concentration camp for Putin. We know that people die every day because of him. So Ukraine becomes a concentration camp. We lose a major democratic country. Then Putin's not going to be done. He's going to start after other countries. He's going to go into the Middle East. He wants he and China to form a partnership and
Right.
control the world. Is that what the United States wants? And
Well,
you're going to have to defeat Putin sometime. If you don't defeat him now, it's going to cost a lot more later, and there's going to be a lot more destruction. So let's talk about what if he does take Ukraine? The consequences are just horrible for Ukraine and for the rest of the world.
well, I think Morgan, I think that it's clear that Europe is thinking along those lines really for the first time. I think that you've seen amongst NATO members a real recognition that this is an extraordinarily dangerous moment. Not that they didn't know it before, but there's something about the U.S. reluctance to send aid that has got NATO countries scurrying to up their contribution to NATO, and also become much more assertive in terms of sending help. Even this past week, French President Macron suggested that there is a possibility that Western soldiers could make their way to Ukraine, and that has not been floated before. So here's the last question for you both, and it's simply this. So we gather in 2 more years. So it's not 2024, but it's 2026, the spring of 2026. So Morgan, what is Ukraine in the spring of 2026?
Now, Steve, number one, for the world, there's no choice but to defeat Putin. You can't have compromise. He never compromises. You can't give him part of the land. So between now and 2026, the world has got to find a way to defeat Putin. And as you said, the United States is slowly not coming up. So it's interesting that the European Union has substantially increased their commitment to Ukraine
Right.
in the last 3 or 4 months. So the European Union's finally recognizing they've got to defeat Putin. Poland and all of those countries are on the Soviet. So between now and 2026, you've got to defeat Putin.
Yeah.
That's number one. There's no compromise. There's no other thing to do. You've got to throw him out, and you need to throw him out sooner than later. And so it's going to take all of the world's free enterprise countries to throw him out, and all the businesses want him thrown out. They want Ukraine as a marketplace. They want to support Ukraine. They want things to move forward. So everybody's got to pull together. You've got to read the same history book. You got to realize that Hitler, Stalin, and Putin all came from the same cloth. Putin's KGB from the beginning to the end. He could not care less how many people he murders. He's got a distorted sense of history. That's what's got to happen between now and 2026.
All right.
And the States has got to get back on board.
All right. So with that, Andrew, you had the last word here. So it's 2026. We all meet again in 2 years. What is Ukraine?
We're talking. This is the optimist in me. We're no longer discussing what is going to happen to Ukraine. We're discussing how Ukrainian forces are pushing and fighting back and throwing blows and haymakers, and actually defeating and having victories and pushing the Russian forces to the brink. That is my hope. Now that may be a bit too optimistic, and I understand that, but that is my hope, and that's truly what I believe, because I believe NATO is going to give them the function and the money that they need, and the United States is going to supply them, as well as the British, with the tanks and the armament that they need, and we're going to see a turn of the tide militarily.
Well, you both have left us, I think, on a reasonably optimistic note. We have our fingers crossed in this regard. It's these are troubling times, and so I thank Morgan and Andrew for your time this evening. I want to thank everybody for joining us. Really appreciate your attention. Just a reminder that you will see us again in a roundtable format about 30 days outside the election. So look for another Zoom kind of conversation in October. And then we are committed then to meeting after the election. In my mind, I think this is not only the most important election in American history, perhaps it's the most important election in world history. And so we will pay very close attention to it. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your time tonight, and all the best.
Steve, thank you for Ottawa University and all their support for this, and everything they stand for is what Mr. Putin stands against.
There we go. An excellent way to close this. Thank you, Morgan. Thank you, Andrew. And thank you, everybody. And good night.